Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Rebecca Marion, and I am the Associate Executive Director here at the community. And I appreciate everyone coming to my first State of the Village. So I am a little nervous, but we will get through this. And if there will be an opportunity for questions afterwards. And I hope that this is beneficial. So today we are going to be discussing what my role is. That has been a question from quite a few residents on what departments I actually oversee, what my responsibilities are, and hopefully that will answer these questions. We're then going to talk about COVID. I know that has been a topic of interest over the last 18 months. But I do feel like I have a story that maybe all of you have not seen yet, and I did want to share that with our independent living population. Some team recognitions that I wanted to notify you of, and then we will have Dion Simpson, who is our assisted living administrator. She will come and speak for a few minutes, and then we will have Jennifer Reagan and Patricia Jones speaking for the pavilion updates. And then at that time, we'll do questions. So what do I do every day? It seems to be, a hodgepodge of different things, whatever gets thrown at me. But my actual responsibilities includes overseeing all of our healthcare departments, which would be the health center, who is run by Jennifer Reagan, the assisted living, who is supervised by Dion Simpson, our home care department, which Josh Brown has been over since the beginning of this year, but as we have been announcing over the last few weeks, that is now transitioning over to Kim Brookso. Health service navigation, again, Kim Brookso. If you saw the broadcast this morning, I announced that we would be merging the two departments, our navigation department and our home care department, mainly because there's so much that intertwines between those two areas, and it really does help with productivity and communication by putting those under one director. So Kim Brookso will be starting October 1st, and will oversee the social workers as well as the home care department. I also oversee environmental services, so Patty Gentry's department, and then wellness. So I put Erin Crawford's name up here. She will be joining our community family on October 4th as our wellness director. Prior to the last month, wellness and environmental services, along with resident services, has reported to Patty Gentry, and she has done a phenomenal job with manning all three of those programs. However, with growth, it's time for us to separate that wellness portion and really have one person focus primarily on wellness. So Erin will be joining us in a few weeks. And those are the departments that I oversee. Next, we're going to talk about, I also am the COVID police for the campus. I'm not really sure how that happened, other than last year when COVID started, Howard DeWitt was the supervisor of healthcare, and I believe that he really didn't necessarily want to learn something completely new. So he did gradually start giving COVID to me, and over the year, it has now become the COVID police department. So pretty much any question that happens with COVID for any department on campus, any resident on campus that has a question, it generally funnels through me. I do not make those decisions on my own. That would not be a smart decision. But I will go over who I connect with on our campus and who's really a part of the decision making when it comes to how we respond to COVID. If you have a concern related to one of my departments, And this goes for Heather's departments as well. But if you have a concern related to one of my departments, please go to those directors first. It's all of us were at one point in a business position, a supervisor position, and it was never a good thing when somebody goes to your boss before they come to you. And so we want to still have that environment here. We want our directors to be responsible. We want them to know and be able to solve problems. However, if it is not resolved and you do need some extra layers of support, please feel free to contact me regarding those departments. My email is on the screen, and then my extension is located in the directory for you. All right, so we're going to start back at the beginning with COVID and kind of walk through what we went through on the healthcare side. It is no question that everybody on this campus experienced COVID in one form or another. It was very different on the other side of campus in a healthcare area. And I wanted to give you just an overview of what the healthcare team experienced over the last year and a half, give you a little insight to the building, because I know that nobody was able to actually see inside the buildings during those times, and what ways the healthcare team was challenged to think outside the box, to think of stuff that nobody else had thought of before. So that's a little bit about what this presentation will cover. March 13th, 2020, the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services issued guidance that there would be no visitors allowed into the nursing home. They gave us that the morning of the 13th. We had to put that up by 5 o'clock that afternoon. That's really hard to swallow as a family member and as a visitor, to show up one day and be able to see your family, and by the end of the day, not know when you're going to see them again. The Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services did not offer much room for grace in this. If a visitor was allowed in the building, it was an automatic fine. Families didn't necessarily understand that because their loved one was more important than a law. And at that point, COVID had not picked up to the point where it had gotten in the summer. So not everybody was understanding the importance of COVID and the transmission of COVID. June 9th, 2020, we had our first employee test positive for COVID-19. No additional cases resulted from this, and at the time, you had to have 2 cases of COVID in order to be considered an outbreak. So even though we had our first positive, we still didn't really experience what the fallout would be for COVID. That employee didn't even know that they were sick. Had gone to a wellness check. They had done a COVID test because everybody was testing everybody at that point. It had become positive, and that's what we dealt with. Fortunately for us, none of our residents were exposed to this person, and we at that time continued life as we knew it inside the 4 walls of the pavilion. On August 10th of 2020, that changed. 2 healthcare residents were sent out to the hospital for something completely unrelated to COVID. And at the time, anytime you go to the emergency room, they tested you. And I remember it was 8 or 9 o'clock that night. I was at home, not thinking anything other than day-to-day things. And Dr. White called me and she said, "We have 2 positives." And my first answer was, "No, they're false positives. It can't be happening. That's not where we're going with this." And she said, "No." She said, they were PCR tests. They are positive. We've got an issue. Both of these residents were on the same hallway, which makes sense because COVID is an airborne transmitted virus. These 2 people were living across the hall from each other, so again, makes sense. The doors were open, air transfers, and both of these residents were also on aerosol generating procedures, which means that they either received a breathing treatment, they were on oxygen, they had a nebulizer, anything that would pretty much generate the air from their respiratory system. So putting everything into the air. On August 13th of that year, Durham County Health Department placed Crosdale Village in outbreak status. And that pretty much changed everything that we did. Outbreak status at the time was classified as 2 people. As time would progress, an outbreak is now classified as 1 positive case. Now remember, last year was a pandemic. We've had pandemics before in the world, but usually, or in our case, none of us that were leading during the pandemic had been alive during the last pandemic. So it felt like we were starting from scratch. We had no policies. We had no protocols. We had nobody to tell us that this is how you're supposed to do this. In an internship to become a nursing home administrator, this was not covered. I think all of us as administrators looked at our preceptors and said, why didn't you teach me this? But we just didn't know. At the end of August, we had 9 employees that were positive, 15 residents were positive, and we had to do 21 room changes in 48 hours. That's a lot. And we couldn't have anybody come in and help us because nobody could come in unless you worked in the building. With testing positive, as some of you have learned over the last few months, when you test positive, you're out of work for 10 days or you're in quarantine for 10 days. So during the 2 weeks of August, we were out 9 full-time employees. We also had residents that were sick and needed to be quarantined into 1 central unit. In order to create a unit, we had to clear the negative residents out in order to put the positive residents in. And remember, at this time, we still didn't know what the best practice was. Now, in the pavilion, we have 1 completely empty wing that's just for COVID positives so that we don't have to displace 21 people. But we didn't know. So the team pitched in together, and within 48 hours, they moved all of these residents. And I need to say this because it's important. That's a lot of work. The first resident that went out on August 10th that tested positive, I walked with that resident from his room to the ambulance because he was scared. 7 days later, I tested positive. So these 21 room moves and this protocol that happened without me in the building because I couldn't be here. Now, with Zoom capabilities, phone calls, and all of that, it made it possible for me to at least be a part of it. But the pavilion team did everything that they could to make sure that our residents were taken care of and that protocols were followed. This happened all across the country. Leadership in multiple buildings and hospitals and nursing homes were all testing positive because they were trying to help, not knowing that they had an issue, and then they ended up getting sick. So very huge thank you to the pavilion team that pulled together and made this happen. Interestingly enough, COVID at the time only affected the 2nd floor of the health center. And this remained true for a couple of months. And why that happened, we didn't know. And we're going to talk about one of the things that we did in order to figure that out. Some of the challenges that we faced, we talked a little bit about staffing. Staff were scared. There was limited education out there for us to be able to tell a staff member of what was necessarily going on. We couldn't guarantee that a staff member wasn't going to come into work and leave being exposed to COVID. They were leaving work and going home to their families, many of them having young kids, and it scared them. I mean, they didn't want to work either. So we were balancing fear. We were balancing employees that had to be quarantined for 10 days on end. And then the health department came out with a rule that stated that you could only work in one building. And what that means is, as many of you know, healthcare workers have multiple jobs. A lot of times they work full-time in one place and PRN in another, or they work PRN in multiple places in order to get their jobs or their money for their jobs. Well, now the health department said, no, that's not happening anymore. Your team can only work in one building. So we had to have a conversation with our employees to say, listen, you need to choose. That took away a lot of our staff too. Now, our full-time staff members stayed, right? Because this is where majority of their hours were. This is where their benefits were, and that was an easy decision. But for some of our PRN people, they had to choose whichever was the best place for them, if it was closer to their home, if they were getting more hours there than here. And that was hard, because what you would hope is when your employees are out with COVID, that your PRN team members can come in and fill in until they can get back. But the health department wouldn't let that happen. So availability of staff was a struggle. Traffic flow. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, I think, but communication, meals, environment. It was one thing to say that the pavilion team couldn't come up to independent living, or independent living couldn't go down to healthcare. But we had to go further, and we had to limit their access even within the building. We had 4 different points of access in order to ensure that team members were not going from one unit to another. They literally had a handbook and a map that showed them what door they had to go into for what unit they were working on that day. They couldn't come through the main door. Then we battled caregiver fatigue. Everybody gets tired. We're already tired. We're tired of hearing new rules every 5 minutes. We're tired of working, 80 hours a week. And that, in turn, sometimes hinders care, and we couldn't let that happen. We also had leadership fatigue. We didn't know what we were doing. I'll be completely honest. We made the best decisions that we could. Nobody was telling us what to do. Nobody was giving us a step 1, 2, 3. We were rolling the dice and trying to make sure that we were keeping everybody safe. Some of those challenges included a difference of opinion. Dr. Heidi White and I are very good colleagues. However, we also had many discussions where we did not agree with what we needed to do. And it's hard because Dr. White was clinical, where I was operational. And at this point, they both had to work, because this was no longer just a virus of clinical issues. This was a virus of maintaining staff, of limiting transmission, of getting supplies that we needed. There were so many different operational things that had to be considered. I remember one day, and I tell this story, so if you see her, you can feel free to share, but there was one day that Heidi and I had a disagreement, and we left the pavilion front door, and we went to walk around the lake, because both of us were frustrated, and we said that we could walk and talk at the same time. Well, we finished lap 1, and she started to turn and go back to the building, and I was like, oh no, we're not done. And I think that day we did 6 laps around the lake in order to talk through everything that we needed to talk through so that we could make a decision. Because if Heidi and I were not on the same page, our team saw that. And our team needed to be able to see that we knew what we were doing, and we knew exactly that we were caring for them and that we had their best interest at heart. And that's hard to do when you don't exactly know what the right answer is. The next thing was low-grade temperatures. They said all along that the first sign of COVID is a temperature of above 100. I can honestly tell you that we have never caught a temperature at the guard shack of a positive person. But at the time, that's what they said. And also at the time, residents were not loving being tested. Nobody wants the test stuck up your nose. It was uncomfortable For residents that had cognitive impairment, it was a nightmare to do. So we didn't want to test people unnecessarily. So we had to figure out who we were going to test, who we weren't going to test. We had to communicate all of these changes without being able to meet with our staff. You couldn't congregate. I had staff members coming in 4 different doors in order to limit transmission. I was trying myself to limit where I went. So how are we going to communicate all of these changes from the government to our staff and make sure they do the right thing? We had to plan for medical staff division. And what that means is our doctors and our nurse practitioners prior to COVID were working in the clinic, they were working in assisted living, they were working in the pavilion, and they were working in the hospitals. Can't do that anymore. They have to pick. And how do you tell a provider to pick? People need medical care. So we had to go down to the drawing board and we had to figure out which nurse practitioners were going to be on which side of campus, which doctors were going to serve this building. Our doctor fellows are also at the Forest at Duke. So we had to figure that out and really come up with a schedule that limited where our providers were, but also offered the care that our residents needed. The next was compassionate care visits. One of the things that our team talked about when this all started was if we couldn't have family members, what were we going to do if a resident passed? We were determined that a resident was not going to pass without their family. We were also determined that we were going to come out of COVID without losing a single resident to COVID, and that was our goal. That team took that to heart because we felt responsible for everything that happened in a world where nobody could control this virus. But that's the kind of team that you had in the healthcare center. We wanted to make sure that families could say goodbye in person. We had no guidance to do so because the government had not yet figured out how we were supposed to do it. So again, trying to make a decision on what was right and what was wrong. Family communication and trust was huge. I had to figure out a way that I was going to communicate with the families in order to keep them updated on what was going on. So I started a newsletter. Some residents, IL residents, were aware of that newsletter and got added to the list so that they could follow. But every week or every change, we sent out a newsletter and we tried to keep them involved as much as possible. I don't think I could count on one hand the amount of concerns that I got back from families for communication because we communicated so much. However, there are nursing homes right now that are having survey teams come into their buildings with 70 allegations, all due to COVID, because they weren't kept up in the loop for what was happening. We were all figuring it out. I'm not saying that we did it perfectly, but we did have the trust of our family. Technology. I told you earlier we had to figure out a way to communicate with our staff. We found a video platform where we could record trainings and we could track who watched the training and then make sure that if they had questions, they had a platform. From March to January, I did 54 recorded videos that went out to our staff. We talked about anything from infection control to visitation to testing to emergency planning because we still had to follow all the other regulations that were in place outside of COVID. And then we did family training. When we started having visitation, the regulation states that we had to have every family member sign off on being educated on the proper infection control practices. So not only were we responsible for training our staff, we were now responsible for training all the family members and making sure that they followed the rules. I can tell you that some family members were not as obedient as others. Innovation was demanded. We had to think outside the box. I told you earlier that when we started with COVID, that it was only on the second floor. I don't know how we maintained that other than we didn't have people crossing units. James Saines called me and he said, "Hey, I need to run something by you." I said, "Okay." He said, "What if we put UV lights in our duct system?" I'm like, "Well, what is that going to do?" And he said, well, it's supposed to clear the duct system and zap it and make it how it's supposed to be. And I'm like, at this point, you can do whatever you want to if it's going to make this stop. I don't care. So he had the UV lights put into place. They were in place for a couple of weeks, and we started seeing a decline. We talked to the health department, and they had asked us some questions, and I told them, I said, well, my plant operations director put UV lights up on the COVID wing, and it seems like we're having a little bit of a slow. And she said, somebody else is doing that. She said, I want to get you guys together because maybe you're onto something. And so we talked, and I think over time, air filtration systems have obviously become more popular in the last year. But this was something that we hadn't done before. So again, thinking on our feet, trying something new, and making sure that it was working. Supply management. You're going to see some things on the next slide, and you're probably going to think you could have done that better, and that's okay. But we did, again, what we thought we needed to do. Oh, next on that picture, that is Dr. Nima Sharda. She is our assistant medical director. She was a fellow here a couple of years ago and has continued to study under Dr. White. You'll see that she's wearing a picture of herself on her. And we made those for our teams because residents couldn't tell who we were because of the mask. And a lot of our residents have cognitive impairment or dementia, and talking through a mask was not working for them. We also found clear medical grade masks for residents that read lips. Because what we were finding was that if we were caring for a resident that had dementia, that couldn't understand what we were saying, they were starting to have behaviors. They were kicking staff, they were hitting, they were throwing things, not because they meant to, but because they didn't understand what we were doing. So we were able to do some research and find some medical grade clear mask so the residents could see our lips. And do you know what? The behavior stopped. Nobody told us that, though. We had to figure that out. So again, thinking on our feet and using all of our brain power in these meetings to figure out what we needed to do. Personal protective equipment, safety goggles, gowns, hand sanitizer. Just because we are a multi-facility organization does not mean that we had clout with the supply chains. Nobody had supplies. They didn't. We had to be innovative. We had to conserve our PPE. We had to use one set of PPE a day. We couldn't change them because we didn't have the supplies. I remember leaving here one day because we needed face shields and we needed goggles. And I went to Harbor Freight and I cleared out their safety goggle section of Harbor Freight because that was going to protect our eyes. And I got up to the counter, and they were like, what are you doing? And I said, I work in a nursing home. We need face protection. And that's what we did. Brittany Wilson, you're going to see a picture of her in a second. Brittany Wilson is our central supply, I want to call her a manager, but she is the guardian angel of supplies. She stayed on the phone. She went to different Walgreens, Harbor Freights, Home Depots, anywhere that would maybe have something medical. And she made sure that we got what we needed. It took us a while to build up what we needed, but we eventually got there. We got to the point where we had to go to a local distillery to get hand sanitizer. And let me tell you, the way that that smells, it will make anybody motivated to go find some different hand sanitizer. Okay? It was very strong. But what you see up here, which one is my pointer, Jeff? Oh, yeah. What you see right here is the inside of a stairwell in the pavilion. Each employee had a bag that kept their supplies because we needed to make sure that we were being good stewards of our supplies, keeping them separated and making them accessible. This is not ideal, but this is what most nursing homes had to do. They had to figure out a way that this could happen. They also couldn't come through one central location, remember? So we had to have all 4 different areas that we're utilizing and making use of space to get their supplies. Innovation is hard because solving problems people didn't know they had and building something no one needs look identical at first. Now we know how to do this, but this wasn't something that anybody would think of before. But what you're looking at is the stairwell that enters into the COVID wing of our building. Down here, these were for employees that had not worked that day. They could get their start. It also included their time sheets because there were not time clocks in every location. So we had to do a lot of manual time entry in order for our employees to get paid. Along the walls, you see the papers again, and then right here, you see a biohazard box for when they left for the day. They would doff their PPE, throw it in the biohazard, and then housekeeping would come and get it. And that's how we did day-to-day life for months. Day-to-day activities. So on this side of the screen, you see Dr. Heidi White. Right here is the entrance to our COVID wing. It wasn't good enough for the health department for us to use our fire doors. What we had thought was that we could close the COVID wing off by using the fire doors. That would seal it off. They could enter in through the stairwell and that would be fine. The problem is that you can't take trays from the kitchen outside up the stairwell. Laundry doesn't necessarily need to go outside. Supplies doesn't need to go outside. So we had to come up with a neutral zone. So we worked with Bearcon, and they created this zipper door. So these white things on the side, they zip up, and there is a space, probably maybe half of the way from me to the stage, and that's called a neutral zone. So people would open the door, they would take their stuff in, they would drop it off and come out, zip the door back down, and then the COVID staff would come out, they would get the stuff and take it back in. So that way we weren't exchanging air. And that's what we had to do. Now, we got very excited towards halfway through COVID when we weren't having any resident cases, and we ripped that down out of celebration, and then a week later I had to call James and I'm like, we need it again. So we left it up for a while this time, but that's what our neighborhood looked like. We talked about PPE lining the stairways to keep supplies in one location. We talked about staff entering in through 4 different locations. Communication with emergency services was huge. They couldn't bring people into the front of the building. We had to figure out where they were coming, who was going out, and direct them on what door to go into. It's one thing to call them to a community, but to try to get the truck that's coming and to tell them which way to go, it was hard. Reviewing twice-a-day temperatures every day. Residents had to have their temps taken twice a day because remember, the temperature is what's supposed to tell us if you're COVID positive or not, but that's not true. So we had to review those temps. The DON at the time and myself would sit at home and we would literally run a report every night and we would look because we couldn't afford to wait till the next day to not catch a temperature, which added stress onto that too. We stopped scheduled Tylenol. What does Tylenol do? Mask your fever. So we thought that our positives were happening and we weren't catching the fever, so we stopped the scheduled Tylenol. We were trying to figure out anything and everything that would help us with this COVID situation. We implemented walkie-talkies. I told you that the one team brought the items into the neutral zone and they came out. Well, each side had walkie-talkies, and that's how we talked to the team because we couldn't go up there and they couldn't come down. So that's how we communicated. We also implemented video monitors. We needed to preserve our staff. The more our staff went into a resident's room, the more they were exposed to the virus. So we went and bought baby monitors, and we placed the baby monitors in the rooms with permission of the resident and permission of the family, and we monitored them outside the room. We provided care for them. They could talk to us. We could talk to them, but we had to figure out a way to preserve our staff and care for our residents. So we got baby monitors. Some of our bright moments, it wasn't all bad. This team that you see right here is part of our COVID team. Most of these people voluntarily signed up to work the COVID wing. Some of them were there because that's where their normal unit was assigned. But we had this thing where we started, and it was called the Clinical Excellence Recipient. Because remember, for the state, it's not good enough just to do COVID. We had to do everything else. So they were still having to do their documentation. They were still having to make sure that all their daily tasks were done. They were still having to make sure that we were moving programs forward. And this team on the COVID wing knocked it out of the park every single month. They were dedicated to what they did. I don't know if that was because they were so busy that they didn't have time to not do stuff, but it's just a phenomenal team. We had to do a lot of things that we couldn't have families for. This gentleman right here, you may recognize as Porter Kier. He and his wife were in the pavilion at the same time, but on different floors because we couldn't work it out for them to be together. We didn't have the space and we couldn't cohabitate. They celebrated their 70th anniversary. How were we going to do that with them? So we worked with their family, and their family created memories of them, their wedding, their family, gave them their vows that they said to each other. You'll see this iPad that's on the stand. Mary's on the other side of that iPad. And we celebrated them with our dining department with a lunch. They both got the same meal. We got it at the same time. They were able to have an anniversary dinner together virtually. And those are the types of things that we tried to do that made it special. It didn't make it normal, but it made it special. You'll also see down here their anniversary cake that's written on their plate for happy anniversary. In the middle, we have Miss Kay Murray and Ashley Prinz. This is one of our first outdoor visits that we were allowed to have. Kay celebrated her birthday. She was going to be 88. And we asked her, what do you want for your birthday? Kay was really struggling, was very depressed. And she said, I just want to see my family. I don't want anything else. Don't give me balloons. Don't give me anything else. I just want to see my family. And at the time, Kay did not qualify for a compassionate visit, so there was nothing that we could do. So we started putting our heads together, and actually I think this was before we were allowed to have outside visits, but we got her family here from different parts of the state, and we took her out to the parking lot, and I asked her, I said, Kay, what did you want for your birthday? She said, I want to see my family. And all of her family was right there on one side of the table, and she was on the other. But the team really put that together. I said yes, they did all the work, so they get all the credit for that, but just another example. Miss Blanche Bragg is right here. Blanche celebrated her birthday on the COVID wing. Not a great way to celebrate your birthday. But we wanted to do something different. We also were having a really bad issue with getting her to eat. And she wasn't eating for us. She wasn't, eating ice cream. She wasn't eating, period. And we had to figure out a way to get her to eat. So we called her son and we're like, what's her favorite food? He said, I always take her to Chick-fil-A. She said she loves Chick-fil-A. So here we go, off to Chick-fil-A. She ate all of her nuggets that day. But you'll see we celebrated with her birthday hat and our PPE and made sure that was a special day for her. One day I left the village defeated, and I looked up from my car and this was outside. And I took it and I put it on my computer because I knew that it was going to be okay. I didn't know it was going to be okay, but it had to be okay because we were not going to survive any other way. But I keep this because there was a reason that day there was a rainbow outside. And it's just a beautiful oversight of our community. So at the end of November, we had 22 residents that had tested positive, 20 staff members had tested positive, and now COVID had spread to the first floor of the health center. We were in something different at that point. In December, we had 24 days where we had no resident positives. In order to exit outbreak, you had to go 28 days. We were at 24. On December 4th, another resident tested positive. So here we go again. We start back at day 1. We went 17 days with no resident positives. And then on December 21st, we had another resident positive. So you can imagine the emotions of the staff as they're caring for our team. We get to the point where we think we're through, and then we get knocked down again. But vaccinations are coming. The first Crosdale Village employee to be vaccinated in early to mid-December was at the Durham VA Medical Center. This is Iris Pleasance. She is one of our licensed practical nurses and has been here for years. She sent me this text and she was like, Rebecca, it's going to get better. Don't worry. So we used Iris's picture to circulate before our clinics to make sure that everyone knew that we're in this together, no matter what section you're in. January of 2021, we had a partnership with CVS Pharmacy for employee and healthcare resident vaccinations. They did a federal contract for 3 on-site clinics. We could only do Moderna. And lessons learned for that was you have to schedule. Our first clinic, we had people that showed up and waited 4 hours to get their shot. We had some staff members leave because they couldn't wait anymore. So the next time we started scheduling. And as you can see from your clinic that we had here on campus, it went very smooth because we scheduled everybody. So we learned that lesson before you experienced it. So you're welcome. Second wave of COVID. In January, the first floor really took off. We had 18 residents test positive for COVID. That was our first floor wave, and this was after we had had a couple of them vaccinated. So we were very frustrated at that point. This happened because the first floor had more cognitively impaired residents than the second. If you've ever tried to get somebody with dementia to wear a mask and to stay in one place at one time, it's almost impossible. So it did happen. It was like a domino effect, and we had these residents test positive. We did our first antibody treatment, which is a blood infusion that helps COVID-positive residents get antibodies to fight off the virus. We had 5 residents that received this infusion with positive effects. They had to be a high-risk individual, have a positive COVID test, have not been admitted to the hospital, at least 12 years or older, and it had to be given within the first 10 days of positivity. We found out that this was a possibility on day 7 of some of their tests. So we had to make this happen within 24 hours in order to get the policies, the staff, and the medicine into the building. But we did it. The second wave ended in February. We had 1 case in February. The last resident case that has happened in the pavilion was on February 15th, 2021. Contact tracing revealed that this resident in particular was exposed at the hospital and admitted prior to having a positive test. In March of 2021, the last team member tested positive of that outbreak on March 1st, and we graduated from outbreak status on March 29th. These individuals that I'm going to go through real quick are the ones that made the biggest difference with COVID, and they were our volunteers that worked on the COVID wing. Chastity Barnett is our healthcare scheduler. I don't know if any of you have ever scheduled in your life, but now is not the time to be a scheduler. She has gone above and beyond to know our team, to figure out how to be flexible with them, to work with them, and to really make sure that our residents are taken care of. Vanessa Brown, our nursing supervisor. Phyllis Davis, CNA. Carissa Campbell and Meredith Faggart were our social workers. They mainly ran the FaceTimes with our life enrichment department to make sure every resident got to talk to their family. And that was huge. Valerie Davis, our housekeeper. Harold Flowers, a custodian. Alicia Hughes, laundry supervisor. Rose Jackson, a housekeeper. Sandy Jacobs, a CNA. Jessica Knox, CNA. Skip Langley, a CNA. Terry Miller, our infection preventionist. I told you I didn't make my decisions by myself. Terry and I are connected at the hip when it comes to making a COVID decision because we need to check each other along with everybody that's on this board. Brian Parrish in maintenance. Darlene Poe, a CNA. Angelo Rainey, maintenance. Kathy Shands, nurse. Carnisha Snuggs, nurse. Shalika Stringfellow, nurse. Riley, nurse. And Brittany Wilson is the supply queen. It's a big group of people, but when you look at everything that they did last year, it's not a big group of people. They gave everything. They didn't have an attitude. They showed up voluntarily, and they did what needed to be done. This is not to say that other team members did not do the same, but they were the ones on that COVID wing, and they were the ones that really put themselves at risk. In summary, we had 54 residents during the biggest COVID wave test positive. 45 of those residents were healthcare residents. 9 of those were independent living residents. As far as team members go, we had 46 total team members. 27 were in healthcare. 19 were in independent living. We had 8 fatalities, which we've talked about on many broadcasts. All of those fatalities were above 95 years of age, and that's not to say that because you're over 95, you're not going to make it. We have someone that's 102 in the pavilion that had it and is still going strong. But these people did have other comorbidities. Vaccination numbers, our residents currently are 99.99% vaccinated. Every single resident in the pavilion and every single resident in the Friendship House are vaccinated. Team members are still sitting at 72%. The pavilion vaccination rates are hovering between 76 and 77. A vaccination mandate update. The Biden-Harris administration announced on August 19th that COVID vaccinations would be mandatory for employees of all nursing homes who received Medicare and Medicaid funding. On September 9th, the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services announced their intent to work with the Centers of Disease Control to develop a policy mandating vaccinations for nursing home workers, hospitals, dialysis facilities, ambulatory centers, home health agencies as a condition of participating in Medicare and Medicaid funding. This helps us because that means that if our team chooses to leave, they can't go to any of these other places without being vaccinated. On September 10th, 2021, OSHA partnered with CMS to require employers of 100 persons or more to mandate vaccines or mandate weekly testing. So that's where we stand right now. CMS will release an interim rule that will be issued in October. Crosdale Village will implement the interim final rule for all employees here once the rule is released. Currently, 28% of our employees are unvaccinated. That is community-wide. We continue to have bi-weekly vaccination clinics available for our employees, and we continue to educate and find resources to help the employees through their decision. And at this time, I'm going to have Dion Simpson come up. You're good.
Good afternoon. I'm on. I'm Dion Simpson. I'm the assisted living administrator. I hope you've at least seen at least one of my broadcasts. I've been at Crosdale this is my 22nd year. So this afternoon I will speak a little bit about our assisted living venues. Our assisted living started, as many of you may recall, with 30 beds in Friendship House. In speaking just a little bit about Friendship House, is what made it special is that it really had a warm appeal because it was so small, but it was also dark and it didn't meet the needs of this community. So as the community aged and had a greater need for assisted living services, we knew we had to expand. So today we have 3 venues. We have the Orchard, which is the 2-story building out to our right. We have Main Street, which is right off the bistro that many of you have visited. And then we have the Magnolia, which is our memory support center. The Orchard accommodates 36 residents, and we also have companion suites in that unit, which is unique to us. We are able to accommodate a husband and wife in the same dwelling. Prior to this renovation, husbands and wives or companions had to maintain 2 apartments, so they couldn't live together before this renovation. On the suites on Main, we have 10 rooms, and then our memory support center, 16. We also have the Judith Moore Theater that's there. On Tuesdays, we do documentaries, and on Fridays, we have matinees. That space is open to all Crowsdale residents, so you would simply call to reserve the theater if you wanted to use it. We also have the Bird Watchers group that meets there weekly. Our assisted living is 4-star rated, which is the highest rating that an assisted living can receive. Most assisted livings in the area are surveyed annually by the Department of Health and Human Services. We are surveyed every 2 years because we are at the highest level. Some of the things that they look for in our rating is our resident care, the fact that we have nurses, the fact that we have a generator on site, the fact that we participate in a quality improvement measure. So if we identify something isn't right, we will submit an action plan to say, hey, we realize we're not doing this quite right. We're forthcoming with our errors. This week, we are celebrating Assisted Living Week. So if you've seen any of the assisted living team, yesterday we had an animal theme, so we all were to dress like forest animals. I was a gazelle, someone else was a deer, so we had different animal attire. Today we had a big hunting event, and we did a scavenger hunt, so most of us had some kind of hunter-type clothing on. So throughout the week, we had visitors from the Wildlife Association that came to see our residents. We were able to pet and feel and interact with the animals that are there. One of the things that I like about assisted living is we really have found a way to capture life again. So you may have your challenges physically, cognitively, but we're finding a way to connect you to the community, to the Durham community, to the Crowsdale community by taking away some of the harder things that you may have to face, whether that is maintaining your home or managing your medications, managing life. So we take hold of that so that you can continue to live and engage in activities. Thank you. Jennifer Reagan.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jennifer Reagan. I am the Pavilion Administrator. I am here with our Director of Transitional Services, Ms. Patricia Jones. We're going to take a couple of minutes this afternoon to talk to you about the Pavilion, what services that we offer in the Pavilion, and also our 5-star rating that we are very proud of. And I would like to acknowledge Ms. Rebecca Marion, my preceptor, because as she was going through the different COVID slides, we realized exactly how much we learned from her during that process, so that in the event we have to deal with that again, that we'll be much more prepared. So thank you, Rebecca, for that. And I was also admiring Ms. Simpson's slides, thinking that we should have put some of our residents' pictures up today, because we did have a very good outing last week. We went to Sparks Park and had a fishing excursion, and the residents had a great time, and we were very excited about that. But at this time, I'll turn it over to Ms. Patricia Jones, who will speak a little bit about the Pavilion.
Hello. The Pavilion is a skilled nursing facility. We have 110 beds. We provide services for wound care, pain management, IV therapy, respite care, hospice care, and dietitian services. We have on-site physician services, which many of you know through the clinic, rehabilitative services, physical therapy, including aquatic therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and life enrichment programs. One of those was the excursion Jennifer was just speaking of. We're rated for excellence. We're currently rated as a 5-star, and that is through CMS. The health inspection, 4 out of 5 stars. Staff rating is 4 out of 5 stars. Quality of resident care, 5 out of 5 stars. And our overall rating is a 5-star. We're the only CCRC skilled nursing center in Durham that has maintained a 5-star facility rating while admitting residents that require rehabilitative and skilled nursing care. This allows us to continue utilizing and increasing our skill set so that we can provide for the needs of our residents as our acuity increases. And the 5-star rating is a quality rating system created by CMS provided for consumers to compare nursing homes. What is it based on? Facility performance. Rating is between 1 and 5 stars. 5 much above average, 10 much below average. 1 much below average. 1 much below average. Health inspections. 3 most recent health inspections, including compliance. Staffing determined by the number of hours of care provided each day. And quality measures measure information on 15 physical and clinical measures. And those are things, oh, my baby. I love that little girl. Do you have any questions related to the healthcare center that I can answer? Great.
No, you're good. All right. So that was a quick overview of assisted living and the pavilion. At this time, I am done with our State of the Village presentation, but we'll open for a few questions if anybody has any. I have mics in the back.
This doesn't have anything to do with the COVID, but you're talking about scheduling of clinics. Are we receiving the flu clinic on Friday?
The flu clinic is Friday, September 24th.
Oh,
Not
okay.
tomorrow, but next Friday.
Okay.
It will be in this auditorium, and you will be contacted about a time between tomorrow and the beginning of next week. We're working on that schedule right now. We have about 480 residents to schedule, so you will be contacted with your time to get your flu shot next Friday, the 24th, in the auditorium.
Who's the baby?
Oh, this is Emerson. Emerson just turned 2. That is her birthday outfit. She just turned 2 at the end of July.
Is she yours?
She is mine. Sorry. Yes, she is mine.
I have a question. We have had a number of independent living residents vaccinated who tested positive after travel. But my question is, of the residents who were vaccinated who've tested positive, how sick have they been?
Not very. And that's one thing that is dangerous about spreading the virus is because some of them have had runny noses, sore throats, and headaches. Those are some things that we would attribute to a summer cold or a fall cold, but they have tested positive. So it is important that if you are experiencing even the mildest of symptoms, that you just be careful. We don't want you to live in a box, but at the same time, we want you to be careful so that we don't have a larger problem.
For new residents moving in, are they required to be vaccinated before they come in?
That has not been a requirement, but I will tell you that we haven't ran into any resident that hasn't been. And I have a feeling that that's going to continue to be the case unless there's a medical reason. But the marketing department does let me know when new move-ins come in and they send me their cards and I log them into a system. 1 in the back and 2 up here.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to know if those forms need to be turned in ahead of time.
The flu consent forms that you received in your box do not need to be returned ahead of time. You can bring them with you to your appointment.
Of the 28% of the employees that haven't been vaccinated, has there been any survey as to why they're not why they don't want to be vaccinated?
I wouldn't say there's been an official survey, but we have talked to each one of those individuals. What we did was when I audited back in August, as I tasked our department directors, I sent them a list of the employees in their departments that weren't vaccinated. They talked to each one of them individually, re-educated them again. There are a myriad of reasons. Some are going the exemption route, whether it's medical or religious. However, they have not been approved for those exemptions. Some of them is freedom of choice. Some of them, there is some debate on the ingredients in the vaccine, and we are working with vaccine developers to work with those employees about what's in the vaccine. Misinformation from social media, most likely, but it's been a myriad of reasons. With OSHA partnering with requiring it with 100 people or more, I have a feeling that we're not going to see as many people leave as what we had originally thought. But again, we still have not received the final policy from CMS, so we're not sure what that's going to say. And we do have some employees that have told us that they are going to get vaccinated, but they're going to wait until the last minute.
Is there a question right here?
What's going to happen to the ones who refuse to be vaccinated?
So the question was, what happens to an employee who refuses to get vaccinated? Well, that employee will be placed on a 30-day personal leave, giving them the ability to think about what they want to do. If they choose to get vaccinated within that 30 days, then they will return back to work and have a job for that. If they choose not to get vaccinated, then they will be terminated from the system. They will be marked eligible for rehire if they choose to get vaccinated to come back. But that's the process right now.
I was going to ask about the same thing. If we now have 28% of our employees who are not vaccinated, we could lose 28% of our employees.
That is correct.
They're taking a chance on making a lot of people sick or sicker by not being vaccinated, so it's important.
That is also correct. And I think we as a community and we as a resident body have to partner together, because if we do lose even half of 28% of our employees that aren't vaccinated, that's going to definitely hurt our workforce that provides the services for you. And I don't know if you've been outside the gates lately, but people are nowhere to be found. I'm not sure where the workforce is, and I'm sure a lot of company leaders are asking that same question, but we are definitely going to have to rethink how we do things. And I don't know what that looks like. That is a conversation that we are trying to prepare for, while at the same time hoping that our employees make the best decision, which is to get vaccinated. But that is something that we may be facing in the next couple of months.
Is it true that all the residents are vaccinated now?
We are 99.99%.
How many does that mean?
One.
Okay.
And there is a reason for that. And I am very aware of that reason. So for all intensive purposes, we are 100% vaccinated. But statistically speaking, we are 99.99.
Rebecca, would you clear up the issue of quarantine when a resident is off campus, out of state?
Yes. So we have a lot of residents traveling. I had a resident email me last week, and they said, what is your opinion of quarantining when I enter back into the community? Technically, you do not have to quarantine when you come back into the community. I will tell you that most of our resident positives that we have had are fully vaccinated and have just gotten back from traveling out of state. So this resident emailed back and said, I want to know what you think I should do. And I said, well, if I were you, knowing where you've been, knowing that the transmission rate is high and that you've been out for a while, I would recommend at least quarantining for 5 days when you get back just to monitor for symptoms. I said, but you do not have to. That resident chose to quarantine and is doing what they think is best for them. According to the health department, fully vaccinated people now, and this is new as of September 10th, fully vaccinated people who have been exposed to COVID do not have to quarantine. I don't think that that is necessarily super smart because we want to make sure we slow the transmission, right? So we want to at least give it some time. But if you were to ask me if the health department requires quarantining, the answer is no. I think we all have to take responsibility for where we've been and the possibility that we may have been exposed or we may experience symptoms, and we have to act on that.
With the possibility of losing additional workers, is there any way residents can be used to help, like delivering meals, or is there any way a group of residents that would like to be helpful could be used to help alleviate problems from that?
I can definitely bring that idea to Heather. We hope that we never have to deliver meals again. But I can definitely bring that up if residents are wanting to help. We obviously do not want to solicit that because you all did not retire to go back into work. And that is part of our job, is to figure that out. But I do know that there are quite a few residents that want to do things and they want to be involved. But that is something that Heather and I will talk about and see what the best move for our community is. Got one question in the front, Denise.
I think most people may be aware of this, but it's very easy to get a COVID test now from CVS, Walgreens, or the health department. So what we chose to do when we returned from travel, besides a partial quarantine, was to just get tested.
Yeah, and that's smart. We did have residents that got back that couldn't schedule a test right away just because there were so many people getting tested at that time with the surge. But he is correct. If you plan ahead, you can get your COVID test scheduled. We will test people that have been exposed or symptomatic, obviously, in the clinic. There are also at-home COVID rapid tests. I'm not saying how accurate they are, but they do have those. What we do ask is that if you test positive, please tell us. Please tell us. It's not embarrassing. It's something that is a safety measure. We need to make sure that we are doing our part. If we do not know that you're positive and it continues to spread and we don't know where it's at, it makes our jobs a lot harder. COVID is a reality, okay? It's a condition that we can do nothing about other than wear our mask, wash our hands, and stay socially distanced. And we want to make sure that we are being vigilant with what our protocols are and that we are protecting the whole of our community. And we don't need to let a positive result or telling somebody about a positive result get in the way of that.
If that seems to be all the questions, I think we need to give this young woman a standing ovation for what you did.
Thank you.
It's all the things you figured out.
It was a group of minds in the think tank for sure. Well, I thank you so much for coming this afternoon. The presentation will be available on, we got one more question.
I just wanted to say this even before Bonnie came in. For the ones of you that have not had direct experience with the pavilion, I've had a direct experience. And within the past year, I've experienced some pretty sad things and saw things, but this was what I wanted to say. I want to give a virtual hug to all of you folks that work in the pavilion that helped Charles so much. And it was just, it meant so much to me, the fact that I was